Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the Art with World. I am your host, WAHEED. World is changing fast, and so is world literature, particularly novel. We'll discuss this subject today with a very distinguished guest, Dr. Safir AWAN. Dr. Safir AWAN is a translator and a poet. He is currently serving as Pro-Rector of National University of Modern Languages, and his areas of interest include Urdu literature and its translations. He has translated Mustadhar Hussain Tarar's novel Bahau as Sorrows of Saraswati, and recently his new translation has been published, which is translation of autobiography of famous poet Kishwar Naheed, Buri Aurat Ki Dusri Katha. He has translated it as Second Story of the Bad Woman. Welcome to our show, Safir Saab. How are you?
Thank you very much, Arshad Saab. I am fine. Thank you.
Dr. Safir, I had opportunity to attend the book launch of your recent translation, which was Kishwar Naheed's autobiography, and it was a very successful function, and I learnt a lot from different aspects of translation, literature, and everything. Congratulations for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your presence also there.
Today's topic is world literature. World literature was a term, as you know, coined by famous German writer Goethe, and that suggested the capacity of literature to transcend national and linguistic boundaries. How would you define world literature, its term, and how it's interpreted these days?
Yeah, thank you very much. This term has a little bit of history behind it. First, it was coined formally by the German writer Goethe. In German terms, it still is Weltliteratur or world literature. So when he coined it in the 19th century, at that time, the Western colonial project was at its peak. And because of those intercultural connections and geographical reach of the European states and societies, they were able to come into contact with the Eastern cultures and their various art forms, their literatures. Because of that contact, the European writers were able to see the richness of many Eastern texts and cultures and cultural practices. Therefore, a kind of formal study of these texts and these writings started in the European locations. Uh, Many departments of comparative literature were also established during this time, and throughout the 20th century, these departments and, in fact, many associations of comparative studies of literature, they were also established in universities, European and American universities. So much so that three distinct schools of comparative literature and world literature they came into existence. That is, the first one was this German, the second was French model, and the third in the late 20th century that was the American model. So we can understand that the Euro-American scholars they were much interested in many texts in the East, though their contact with the Eastern societies and their cultures and their literatures has a very long history, but particularly during the 20th century, after this decolonization started, we see that those literatures and cultures were kind of embraced more systematically by the European and American scholars, and in this way, world literature and its study started growing. Initially, these studies and whatever was included or permitted to be included in world literature was mostly Eurocentric. But then, because of increasing immigrations and the migrants going to those societies and so on, many other factors led to what we also call, the globalization. And as a result of all those forces, the global novel, in fact, came to acquire a very important place in global cultures.
So I understand what you say that in fact during colonization there was interaction between different cultures of the powerful and the vanquished both, and that paved the way for local cultures to go to global stage, and many other people who belong to other countries and civil societies, they also became familiar with cultures which were initially localized in their own areas.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, colonization, of course, was a very painful experience for many of these countries and societies. But at the same time, it had its benefits also. For example, um, many of these marginalized states are farmer colonies, and also some microstates. Their indigenous cultures and literatures got some space in the European libraries through translation projects. That's why comparative literature studies and translation studies and translation as an industry, all of these have grown formally, and therefore they have contributed a lot in creating this canon of world literature.
In fact, I remember once way back when there was Newsweek, we used to read Newsweek. There was an article which was written in the backdrop of Vikram Seth's novel, The Suitable Boy. And it had a very interesting title, and that was Empire Writes Back, meaning thereby that the countries which were colonized once, they are now actually dictating modern English novel and poetry. And you can have many examples like Vikram Seth, and then V.S. Naipaul, which who was actually from Trinidad, and he ruled over English literature for quite some time. So in a way, um, the local people created culture which was at par with the international great literature, and in some ways even surpassed that. What do you say about that?
Yes, of course. I mean, this growth in Anglophone literatures in particular, and also this lot of increase in the number of translations of indigenous literatures, both of these things contributed a lot in making these writers popular throughout the world. We also, call them post-colonial writings, post-colonial writers who have been writing, from their own locations, and also they have been fictionalizing and narrativizing their local stories. And later on, because of their, market, because of their demand in the European and American societies, universities, readerships, they became quite popular. In fact, the Caribbean has produced many great writers, and some of them won Nobel Prizes also. A very prominent example is that of Derek Walcott, who was a West Indian poet, and he created a great literature, epic poetry also, for example. In the Odyssey, for example, is one of his, epic poems. Also, not only in the Caribbean, but also in the Indian subcontinent, many writers started writing with that consciousness, which we call the post-colonial turn and the post-colonial consciousness. Um, but that term itself and whatever is associated with it now, that has been compromised a lot because of the fact that many of these post-colonial studies and the critics and the writers who are associated with the post-colonial term, they have been compromised and they have been dubbed as comprador writers by the resistance writers, that they have been writing not only back to the center, but rather they were writing for the center. Of course, when this term was popularized by literary critics and the critics of post-colonialism, post-coloniality, um, but at the same time, this consciousness has grown uh, in the minds of the academics in the former colonies, in the Commonwealth in general, that these writers have, even if they started, I mean, with their local consciousness, but later on, when they were canonized by the European critics, after that they, started to write for the cosmopolitan centers of Europe and the US.
Can you give some examples of resistance writers and those who are termed as comprador writers, writing those who are writing for the center?
Yeah, for example, Ngugi wa Thiong'o is a Kenyan writer, and he has written a lot about this resistance and the need for that resistance. In fact, I mean, he was Christianized as James Clark, but later on he came to adopt his local tribal name, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and he is the one who has talked a lot about this. One of his seminal essays is about the need for closing down the departments of English in the colonies, because those departments actually became the centers for the promotion of uh, the Western canonical writers only, starting from Shakespeare to Hardy and Dickens and George Eliot and T.S. Eliot and so on. So he is a very strong voice in this regard. He stopped writing in English also, and he started writing in his local language. I think that's called Gikeju. So that was a very important, stance, and he was a very important theorist in this regard.
And those who wrote for the center, for example, I mean, I don't agree with that, but it's like V.S. Naipaul and Neeraj
Yeah,
Chaudhary.
yes, yeah. V.S. Naipaul, Khalid Hosseini, many of these Indian theorists like Homi K. Bhabha, Gyatri Spivak, and so many others, even Pakistani writers writing in English, many of them have been accused of this um, this comprador mentality, and therefore they are called the native informants because they have the knowledge of the local indigenous cultures and societies, but the way they portray those societies and those cultures, that has been a subject of lot of criticism by some critics like Gugi.
Well, that can also be called a kind of protectionism. To, I mean, they might be a little. Uh, uh, I mean, it's good there if their culture is being shared by other people as well, and their art is being shared by other nations as well. But maybe they want to keep it protected to their own little circles. But anyway, we'll come back to it later on. Let's just discuss. I mean, we have talked a lot about colonization and post-colonial literature. So, how does it when it merges with current wave of globalization, when nothing has been localized, everything can be shared or communicated to other parts of the world as well. So, what does our time tell about the kinds of world novel, world literature at this time?
Yeah. Actually, as I said that this colonial project, it was a huge machine, and it created many um, ripples in the world, um, and many. I mean, this whole machine, the way it has worked in history, it has created alternative, cultures, and those cultures then started merging into one single global culture. So um, I mean, when these Europeans, they started reaching to these far-flung lands, and they started occupying them, turning them into their colonies, and then at the same time, they took not only the money from here, or the precious, stones and things, and raw material and so on, but at the same time, they took some cultural practices, cultural artifacts, writings to back home. So as a result of this colonial project, other forces, started operating, and gradually we see that a kind of global culture and global literature started emerging. Globalization as a political and economic phenomena has been criticized a lot, as but at the same time, we understand that certain concerns of humanity are common. And therefore, these writers who in today's world are writing about those global concerns and global issues, um, they are producing a kind of narrative through their fiction, through their novels, which is the common concern of almost all humanity. And some of those issues we see are quite common in so many of the novels that have been produced during the last 50, 60 years or so. Um, and people, are able to relate with those stories. It doesn't matter where they are written or where they are produced and published, but there are other things like translation industry and so on, which has contributed a lot in making this literature global, and also framing and narrativizing those global concerns of humanity.
So, very interesting. You have just told us about period of colonization, post-colonization, and current globalization. And we also come across another very important issue, and that is the world at risk. Currently, a lot of things have happened in terms of environment, migration, conflict, violence, extremism. So, how would you define the current world literature is reflecting these issues in uh, its fiction, its poetry? How would you like to explain that?
Yeah. So you see, we used to live in our local realities mostly, and for the most part of history. But now humanity is interconnected in so many ways. these post-industrial technologies, digital technologies, these means of communication and transportation, they have contributed so much in squeezing the world. Um, and because of that, many problems also started cropping up in the world. Uh, for example, our biggest concern, global human concern, is to survive in the face of a number of global risks. And one of the biggest of those global risks is, of course, this environmental change, environmental destruction, global warming. Um, and this is not something which is peculiar or particular to one nation or one, geography, or one country. It's a global concern, and humanity is at a grave risk, um, in terms of its existence, long-term existence on this earth. Therefore, many apocalyptic narratives have emerged in different parts of the world. Many writers from different countries, all of them have been, kind of trying to create this consciousness among the human beings, and particularly um, when their narratives became popular, and then those popular narratives were adapted for the film and for cinema. That concern was quickly kind of entrenched in our sensibility, and therefore now there is a certain political praxis also associated with uh, this environmental activism. So I believe that it's because of the fact that our writers and filmmakers, they have uh, been very instrumental in creating this consciousness and this awareness, leading to this activism and political praxis also. So this is one important global concern. Another one that has always been around, but at the same time, it increased in the wake of 9/11 attacks, and that is the spread of extremism and terrorism in many parts of the world. Pakistan itself has been a huge victim of terrorism, and still it is a victim. Therefore, many of our writers, whether they are local writers writing in our national languages, Pakistani languages, or they are writing in English, um, or even from the Euro-American, locations, many writers have been writing about this rise of extremism, global terror, and so on.
So, can you give us some examples of different novels who picked up these themes?
Yes, sure. I mean, uh, for example, with reference to this global terror, um, the American writers in particular have produced many narratives, such as John Updike's Terrorist, or Don DeLillo's The Falling Man. Within Pakistan, you can mention The Reluctant Fundamentalist by Mohsin Hamid, and also Nadeem Aslam's some of his novels too. They try to see and narrativize the ravages of this monster of global terror.
Okay. And then there was another issue of pandemic, and many a people, many a writer wrote about that. But before that, I think one of the finest example is Blindness by Jose Saramago, which tells us, which I mean, it's not pandemic, but it was in one country, but it tells how much it can be serious if any viral infection or any kind of infection travels, and because of very fast ways of communication, it can travel to anywhere in the world as well.
Exactly. Um, as I said that whenever there is a global concern, global threat to the human existence, um, it becomes the subject of our stories, our films, our documentaries, our art, and so on. So, pandemic, of course, was a global threat, and it was a common human concern. And therefore, just like 9/11 fiction as a distinct genre, the pandemic fiction too has, become a separate genre in novel. Many writers in the world, they have written about it, and in fact some of those writers have been sort of prophetic in imagining such worlds and such situations in the world where some kind of epidemic and pandemic may erupt, and that may become very threatening for the human existence. I can recall Camus' The Plague, for example. That is actually about an epidemic and not a pandemic, but still, there are other writers in our contemporary times who have been writing about this issue.
And I think in many ways, a lot of problems of the world are common everywhere, and that is also, uh, I mean, there's a new trend. There are many a writer, they don't even tell what is the locale of their writings. Like this blindness by Saramago, he doesn't tell where this is happening. So it's so much, its theme is so much universal that anyone can identify that. And a lot of other things like even Garcia Marquez doesn't tell what's the exact locale of his stories, but they have so universal uh, importance that many a people can share as if it's their own story. And even if the stories of violence, the state violence, migration, even if they are happening in certain locale, which writers tells very clearly that this is the story of this locale, but that also looks very familiar with anyone else in the world. If you take the story of disgraced by Coetzee, are currently the Nobel laureate of South Korean origin, Han Kang. Her stories, they are very much localized, but everyone can share with her stories, the story of violence, the story of alienation in her novel Vegetarian. So there are so many examples. This also tells that despite diversity in the world, despite different histories of different nations and races, the human concerns are very much similar in every culture, in every society. What do you say about that?
Yes, of course, this is very true, and we have been discussing this today also. I was just, wondering um about my own, this contribution in translation. One of the books that I have translated, Tarad's Bahau, Sorrows of Saraswati, as you mentioned in my introduction also. Uh, why I translated that particular
I
book
was
in
going
Urdu
to ask
literature.
it.
Right.
Okay.
So, why I chose this particular book. It's because of its contemporary relevance, because it is the story of a village on the bank of a river, um, and how what happens to that river, and how it dries up, and then a whole culture and a whole way of life uh, goes into nothingness in that area. So Saraswati, this a legendary river that used to flow for a very long distance, starting from Himalayas and coming down to Cholistan and Sindh and so on. Ghagra, at one place, this was called Ghagra. So at the bank of the Ghagra, this village exists, but the river changes its course, and as a result, so many villages existing on the bank of that river, and their cultures and civilization were thriving there. But because of that environmental change, um, that that came to extinction. So this is very important that to understand that for the West, maybe it's a more current concern that has come to occupy some space in their discussion and in their politics and in their economics. But for us here in the East, particularly in the subcontinent, um, this environment has always been a very, very important concern. And therefore, this novel by Tarak that was written like I think more than 40 years back, uh, you perhaps cannot see many texts of this nature that were written 50, 40 years back. Of course, now many writers are writing, but we must, I think, underline this fact that our writers had this consciousness much earlier than what is happening in world literature and world culture today.
Yeah, a very important thing you have mentioned here, and that means that there are many things in the world which can be extincted forever, and we have come far beyond the phase, that idyllic period when the life was same for many centuries and there were no risks involved, and people would think that perhaps the world would remain like that forever. But now we have come across different dangers and risks within our environment and societies, and we are facing the risks that the world even can be finished because of maybe human stupidities. Um, but of course, this is a great contribution you have done by translating this novel. And I guess you are also translating Mustansar and Tarar's other work, Rak. Is it so? And
Yes, I am actually working on a number of projects, and one of them is rock. Again, I selected rock because not only of its politics that we see in rock, but also because of environment. In this novel, also, Tarar has this environmental consciousness. It is imbued with that consciousness. So, in fact, many rivers of Pakistan that have been drying up because of the animosity and politics between India and Pakistan, what is happening downstream, because Pakistan is downstream of many of those great rivers. Yes, I mean, he has been very prophetic, Tarar, in these terms.
maybe this current smog in most part of Punjab is also a very important topic to write about, and maybe it can expand. I mean, it has crossed borders actually, and
Yes.
environment has no borders.
Yeah.
So, but it also tells another important point. Maybe you can highlight that better. Uh, Generally, literature, particularly novel, was all about humans and how different things uh, impact human lives, their social concerns, their conflicts, their happiness, their sorrows. In that case, previously, history and many other events were the main things which provide those uh, stage for writer to write his story about. Currently, I think the impact of environment on humans has become another very important uh, uh, subject in which humans interaction between humans can be discussed about in various forms of literature, art and films.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Actually, writing about things and processes and events that have already happened, that is perhaps easy. Um, that is like, wisdom that comes after the event. And the experience that all of us have. And then somebody, wakes up and starts writing about that human experience in fictional terms. But I consider those writers um, as great writers who can foresee what is going to happen in the world, what is going to happen to a particular society or a country or its cultures. Uh, for example, um, Ghulam Abbas' story, Dhanak, if
Yeah, it's
you may
beautiful.
remember. Yeah, I mean
Yeah,
that is a story written in the 60s.
yeah, it's excellent.
Why is it still relevant today? It is
Yeah.
because he could imagine that Pakistan in the 60s, which we are living today. So this is something which we must celebrate. Same is the case with Darud, for instance, that he started writing about these issues which we face now, and of course our existential threats um, that we face now. I believe two of those threats are major threats. One of them is, of course, environment, and the second one is this extremism in our society. Our society has, these currents all the time running into it, and whenever it gets the chance, the extremist ideologies and the extremist mind, it erupts anywhere. So these are two, in my opinion, the big threats to our society. And at least one of our writers has been alive to these threats, and he has been writing and trying to alert us to the coming dangers who have actually now arrived.
Yeah. You have rightly pointed out Dhanak. It was one of the finest stories of Ghulam Abbas, and I just remember now that you have referred to that this story tells a lot about extremism, tendencies, uh, violence, and then what a fine place it was and how it has turned into just ruins. And there are some scientists who are uh, trying to see through telescope on the ruins and dunes of Mohenjo-daro what had happened to this country. It's a great story, and I suggest you to please do translate that as well.
Yeah,
And
sure.
yes, now we have discussed a lot about colonial period, about environment, about extremism. I think there is another very important topic, and that is migration. It has affected world literature in many ways. There are many writers who have been living in their new lands, new countries, because of various reasons, because of their parents migrated, they were unsafe in their own countries, and they went to those places, and they wrote about mostly about the people they knew best, and those were the people of the country that they had left. It was diaspora who was living in those countries. They have talked about, they have discussed about, written about their problems, their alienation, their identity issues. So, would you like to say something about this subject in our contemporary literature?
Yes, of course. I mean, as I said, that one of the, great forces of change in the world and in terms of creating um, these great texts also. It was and still is immigration, migration of large number of people from particularly the farmer colonies and their first generation, getting settled down there, and then trying to live in the cultural clash, and then the second generation trying to assimilate in those societies. And because of that, the way multiculturalism has been celebrated in the Euro American societies, all of that is the result of one thing, and that is migrations of, I mean, so many good number of people, large number of people from these colonies. So when they settled there, uh, because still those were foreign lands for them, and they faced many cultural shocks there. Therefore, many social problems and also ideological problems, like religious issue, they started cropping up in those societies. For example, the issue of forced marriages emerged even in the UK among not only the Muslims but also the Hindus. The Bengali and Indian writers have been writing about that. Um, so this, you are right that this has become a very rich source of writings about the diasporic experiences and diasporic various kinds of diasporas. For example, Asian American diasporas, Pakistani and European diasporas, Indian diaspora. Many writers have, and now in Canada, as we know, that many of these writers have been writing about the people in the diaspora. Not only they have been writing uh, about back home, um, but also whatever is happening to their people, while they try to cope with the Western ways of life, Western cuisine, Western, educational system, and so on. So as a result, of course, so many films have been made based on a number of novels.
So, Dr. Safir, what's the impact of digital technologies on our contemporary literature, particularly novel?
Yeah. So this is another very important force, may I say, um, in our world that is contributing into the making of um, many new forms of literature, experimental literature, such as electric literature and Twitter poetry, um, and so on. So this is a great force. I mean, we know that publishing is such a costly and demanding affair, but now people have democratic spaces on the internet, and they can, write something, they can post something, whatever they like, and therefore, I mean, two things are, of course, happening that because of this democratic right of writing and posting and self-publishing and so on, the quality of these literary narratives is not always desirable to the desirable level. But at the same time, we see that a lot of good literature um, and local stories that do not find space in the mainstream publishing industry, they have found a space on the social media, on the internet, in literary blogs, even in many, there are websites which are run by the literary translators, and literary translations particularly, they have come to acquire a very important place in global literature of our times.
So we can say that because of this digital technology, we are living in a world without borders. But coming to our last point, I would like to hear from you. What's the impact of these literary prizes on literature?
They have a very important role because, um, I mean, of course, they are. Some of them are dubbed as political also. But politics apart, we must not forget that many of these writers who are not from Europe are from the US and who um, are from the former uh, colonies. And even if they are not from the colonies, like for example China or Japan, um, even their writers, they have been given a place in world literature, and they are now in the limelight. That's why it's very interesting to see that Nobel Prize that started in, I think, in 1901 perhaps. Um, if you look at all the prizes, then um, the most of those prizes were awarded to those writers who have been writing in languages other than English. Of course, people who wrote in English, they too have a big chunk of those prizes. But when you compare, then we see that many of those writers who have been writing in not in English but in for example Bengali in case of Tagore, or Hon Kang in case of this recent 2014 Nobel Prize, or even the previous year's Nobel Prize, John Foss, Norwegian. Uh, they have all been translated and they have been awarded a Nobel Prize. So, in that sense, it is good that Nobel Prizes, a lot of them, they have contributed a lot in shaping uh, the, the forms that global literature and global culture is taking in our times.
Thank you very much, Dr. Safir, for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much for taking all the trouble and interviewing, arranging this program online. Thank you so much and see you around.
So, viewers, thank you very much for watching us. See you next Sunday, same time.